What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast tonight. I am your host, Ryan Thomas, once again bringing you another episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Obviously, huge headlines in the world of mixed martial arts. I let the title speak for itself. George St. Pierre versus the Ultimate Fighting Championship, his former employer or current employer. We really don't know. George St. Pierre joined Ariel Helwani on the MMA Hour on MMAfighting.com, a long-running mixed martial arts podcast show hosted by one of the premier mixed martial arts journalists in the world today, probably the premier mixed martial arts journalist in the world today, Ariel Helwani. Helwani had George St. Pierre, Holly Holm, Michael Bisping, Gegard Mousasi, Ray Sefo, the president of the World Series of Fighting, countless guests on the show yesterday. And obviously the one that made the biggest news over the course of the 3-hour show was the former welterweight champion of the UFC, George St. Pierre, guy that held the welterweight belt for 7 years, walked away from the sport 3 years ago. As a brief history lesson, 3 years ago, UFC 167, GSP won his last fight via split decision in defending his welterweight belt against Johnny Hendricks in the octagon. To Joe Rogan in the post-fight press conference, or in the post-fight interview, GSP said that he wanted to take a break from the sport. Not so much as retire, but to take a break. And that is what he has done, and over the last year and a half, there's been inklings and rumors of his return, and GSP then made it known, probably around February, that he really wanted to come back. He's ready to fight again. He's ready to fight in the UFC. Give him a name, give him someone to fight, and let the rest take care of itself. Any event that GSP will be a part of in his return would sell out pretty instantly, especially one in Canada. So UFC 206 is on the books. UFC 206 in Toronto at the Air Canada Centre. The main event as of now was Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Johnson. And rumors were swirling around that on the UFC website there was a fight open on the UFC card for UFC 206, to be determined versus to be determined as the main event. So rumors swirled that George St. Pierre would be the fighter in the main event in his return to the UFC. Although there would have been a light heavyweight title fight, the light heavyweight title fight would have been put as the co-main event, and the return of one of the all-time great fighters in mixed martial arts history, and in my eyes, the greatest mixed martial arts fighter in UFC history, George St. Pierre's return. But GSP talked in great detail, was very blunt with Ariel Helwani, that he had hired a lawyer to represent him in a negotiation with the UFC to bring him back to the sport of mixed martial arts. And really where things started making progress was with Lorenzo Fertitta. Now obviously Lorenzo Fertitta was the owner of the UFC. Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta were the owners, and Dana White is the president of the UFC. The Fertitta brothers sold the UFC to one of the biggest talent agencies in the world today for $4 billion. Now, over the course of that sale, what really happened with that sale, in my opinion, and what has taken in effect since, that sale to the new talent agency, not new, but to the newest, talent agency that is associated with the promotion, William Morris Endeavor, based in Las Vegas. We are, we as in the Ultimate Fighting Championship fans, we are seeing a change of the guard of ownership, not just of ownership, but today 15% of the UFC's employees were laid off. We're seeing Chael Sonnen go to Bellator. We're seeing Rory McDonald go to Bellator. We're seeing tensions arise with Jose Aldo, Anderson Silva, Nate Diaz, Nick Diaz, even more so now. Frankie Edgar, a guy that has been a company man for the better part of his whole entire UFC career. Chael Sonnen, a guy that was a company man. And you could kind of dissect each and every case a different way, but when a man of the caliber of George St. Pierre as a fighter and as a person comes across this list as a former UFC fighter that is disgruntled within the UFC, and this is just current fighters that I'm talking about. We're not talking about the past history of Tito Ortiz and Randy Couture. This is big news. For a guy to say on live, over on the air, that he is a free agent of the mixed martial arts world, the biggest free agent on the scene, and the UFC releases a statement that he is not a free agent. Now, I've tried to, really dissect this as many ways as I can, and really the only way I can dissect it is what first comes to mind over the course of, the situation as it panned out this way. GSP said he wanted to come back. Dana White was in countless interviews saying that GSP did not have what it took to be a fighter any longer, and that, it was time for GSP to admit the fact that he does not have that fight in him anymore, and that Dana White has, said that Dana knows fighters. I know fighters better than anybody, and George St. Pierre didn't want to fight when he was fighting. Why would he want to fight now? Why does he have the itch to fight now? I took that as Dana White saying that maybe, just maybe, the UFC didn't want GSP to come back. And that's something that hasn't really been talked about a lot. Maybe the UFC actually didn't want George St. Pierre to come back. And maybe the UFC doesn't want GSP to fight for another promotion. Knowing what he could do if he were to go from the UFC to, let's just say, the number 2 organization in the world, Bellator. Bellator just recently signed his training partner, Rory McDonald, a Canadian fighter. GSP, obviously the biggest Canadian sports star outside of Wayne Gretzky the last 20 years. That's not a bold statement saying that. Sold out countless events in Canada within 5 minutes. The real problem that I feel that they were afraid of was if George St. Pierre goes to Bellator, Bellator has a giant, massive market to build off of. So now there's loopholes in his contract. The UFC stated that they still believe he is under contract with the UFC, and now GSP's career is basically up in smoke. He can't go to Bellator because he's still signed with the UFC. GSP is saying he's not signed with the UFC, so a battle will ensue in court probably over the better part of this year, and who knows if ever if we see George St. Pierre come back, when realistically, yes, I do think he wanted to come back. Why would he go on UFC Tonight and say that he wanted to come back if he didn't? Why would he lobby for the UFC to give him a fight? Why would he go into negotiations with the UFC for a fight with Robbie Lawler at UFC 206 if he didn't want to come back? His logic was that Robbie Lawler had just pulled out of UFC 205. Robbie Lawler was knocked out in the first round by Tyron Woodley to lose the belt a few months back, and Lawler said that he needed to take a break. Robbie Lawler has been in more wars as a fighter than practically anyone. So why would Robbie Lawler say that he needs to take a break from fighting a guy like Donald Cerrone at UFC 205 and then fight George St. Pierre a matter of a month and 2 weeks later? So GSP was kind of confused by the fact that Robbie Lawler was the one that was offered. And the negotiations between GSP and Lorenzo ended up at a good point. But when the sale of the UFC happened, that $4 billion bullseye was attached to the UFC's back, and the $379 million price tag that Dana White will be paid over the course of 5 years was on his forehead. Fighters want more money. Fighters want to be paid appropriately in comparison to what they have been paid, and this is not going to go away. With the sale of the UFC for $4 billion, fighters are wondering, why are we making less than 8% of what we normally of the actual sale money that was of what this brand that we fight under was just purchased for. Less than 8% of that amount goes towards the fighters. That is ridiculous. And we're going to start to see a huge uproar between not only GSP and the UFC, but many other fighters within the UFC. They told in an email to Georges St-Pierre, according to Georges St-Pierre, we don't know their side of the story on this matter, but GSP said the UFC emailed him and told him that it would be a great task to reintroduce him to the new audience. Let me make myself clear. I've been a UFC fan for almost 15 years. I watched Georges St-Pierre at the beginning. I watched him at the end. Followed his whole entire career. He's one of the main reasons why I am such a huge UFC fan. I enjoyed every fight that he fought in. Respect his career. Admire his career. It would not be a tough sell to a casual fan of what GSP accomplished. You're reintroducing one of the greatest fighters that this sport has ever seen. Boom. Done. That's all that needs to be said. You look at the record books. You look at the longevity that this man had as a champion. 7 years. We're not talking 7 years where he was just fighting, ham and eggers. He was fighting the best of the best. Beat BJ Penn 2 times. Beat Matt Hughes 2 times. Lost to Matt Serra in devastating fashion. One of the greatest upsets, probably the greatest upset in my eyes in UFC history. And he came back from it to become one of the most successful UFC champions that the organization has ever seen. So, this would not be a tough sell. This guy has 2 losses on his record. One by knockout, one by submission. One from Matt Serra, the submission from Matt Hughes. And he avenged both of those losses. Went through fighter, number 1 contender after number 1 contender. He made BJ Penn quit on his stool. Dominated John Fitch. Dominated Thiago Alves. Dominated Dan Hardy. Dominated Josh Koscheck twice. Dominated Jake Shields at a time when nobody was. Dominated Carlos Condit. Neutralized Carlos Condit. Embarrassed Nick Diaz. And did just enough to beat Johnny Hendricks. Market it that way. There's no need to say that this is a situation where it's a tough sell. Are you kidding me? When he left the sport, there was high demand for him to come back within 6 months. This is a guy that is one of the biggest draws that the UFC has ever had. Brock Lesnar, GSP, and Conor McGregor, obviously of today, those are the 3 biggest male draws that the UFC has ever had. And obviously Chael Sonnen is thrown into that mix as well. It's ridiculous. And it's not just a coincidence that it's happening with GSP. As I alluded to earlier, Rory McDonald, Chael Sonnen. Who would have ever thought that Chael Sonnen would fight in any other organization but the UFC? He had a contract written with the UFC. He found a loophole and he got the hell out. That's what happened. Rory McDonald. He needed to win the fight versus Stephen Thompson. He didn't. He bailed. He said, I'm not making enough money now. He's with Bellator, $500,000. He'll make $500,000 in his first fight with Bellator. That's pretty good money. And it'll probably be against a winnable opponent, so he'll get a win bonus on top of that $500,000. Bellator has much deeper pockets than the UFC. And if the UFC is starting to treat their fighters badly, which they have had a history of doing over the course of the last 20-plus years, it's going to get ugly. Now employees are leaving. Now employees are being laid off. This new ownership is going to throw a bit of a wrench in things. And to say GSP is a tough sell, wow. To say GSP doesn't know what it takes to be a fighter, doesn't have what it takes anymore, wow. That says a lot about the character of the people that are running the UFC at this point. Tune in for part 2. Thanks for listening. I'll be back.